Well, thanks so much to everyone for joining us on today's Made of Millions Dear Manager episode in partnership with Mindshare Partners. I'm Kelly Greenwood, the founder and CEO of Mindshare Partners, which is a national nonprofit that's changing the culture of workplace mental health so that both employees and organizations can thrive. Ultimately, really hoping to normalize what it looks like to have a mental health challenge at work and also reduce the stigma. So we build public awareness, we host communities to support professionals and employee resource groups, and we also provide workplace training and strategic advising to leading companies. So today is the last business day of May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month, and today's episode centers around this month's No One Told Me campaign, which was organized by Made of Millions. So this campaign brings awareness to the treatment gap between first experiencing a mental health symptom and seeking support, which leads many to suffer in silence. In fact, it takes an average of 10 years for a person dealing with a mental health condition to seek help. So today, we'll focus on how workplace stigma impacts the mental health treatment gap by preventing conversations and treatment-seeking behavior and what we can do about it. So I have generalized anxiety disorder, which is relatively well managed now, but twice in my life has resulted in debilitating depression, including having to take a leave of absence from work at one point. I now believe that that was preventable. And so today's discussion really resonates on a personal level as well. So I'd love for our two panelists to introduce themselves. Imadé, would you like to go first?
Yeah, my name is Imadé. I am the founder of Depressed While Black. It's an online community. It's an in-progress book, and it's also a charitable initiative where I donate mental health. I donate to mental hospital patients, like personal care items that are Black affirming, like satin bonnets and stuff like that. Originally I wanted to create Depressed While Black because I didn't know anyone else who was depressed while Black, and I felt really alone and isolated. And the more that I, shared my story, the more I realized that, I wasn't alone, and that, there's so many of us seeking and searching for a culturally competent care.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. Really excited to have you as part of this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Matt Johnstone. By day, I work with the Global Service Desk. That's the IT help desk for Verizon Media. I tell people that I'm meeting socially for the first time that I work for what's left of Yahoo and AOL. And I make the computers go. I make sure that in meetings like this, everybody's microphone is working. Also by day, I'm the global co-lead of the Neurodiversity Employee Resource Group, and our mission is to empower all minds. We support employees with ADHD, OCD, bipolar, autism spectrum disorder, and employees experiencing mental health issues like anxiety and depression, and people who love people who are living with those conditions, and really just anybody who thinks that brains are weird. And I'm interested in how much Kelly and Imadé, how much our stories are going to connect. I too had a mental health underlying issue that was not diagnosed for a really long time. And part of my story is of beginning working at what would become Verizon Media and receiving the supports that I needed to get treatment for the first time after a previous career didn't have those same resources. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to help folks find methods for managing their employees in a way that affirms mental health.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Before we dive into the conversation, I wanted to just give our viewers a little bit more context on how stigma in the workplace plays a role in the mental health treatment gap. So bear with me as I go through some stats to make sure everybody is starting from level footing. But mental health stigma, unfortunately, really continues to persist, especially in workplaces, despite the fact that up to 80% of Americans will experience a diagnosable mental health condition at some point during their lifetime, whether they know that or not. So due to the negative perceptions and the fear of repercussions, 2/3 of workers will hide their mental health condition from their colleagues. And actually 95% of employees have taken time off due to stress, have named another reason, like an upset stomach or a headache, rather than admitting the true cause. So as a result, 80% of workers, according to NAMI, with a mental health condition report that shame and stigma prevent themselves from seeking treatment, despite treatment's effectiveness in reducing many mental health symptoms. So last year in 2019, Mindshare Partners did a mental health at work report in partnership with SAP and Qualtrics of employees all around the country. And we found that almost 60% of folks didn't talk to anybody at work about their mental health in the previous year. And when conversations about mental health did occur at work, less than half were described as a positive experience. So that's definitely very telling and unfortunately not particularly surprising to me. But clearly every demographic group and those at their intersections experience mental health in the workplace differently. And there are different factors that create varying degrees of stigma and other challenges for different groups. So I'd love to spend some time first on that stigma piece before really diving in what we can do about it. So Imadé and Matt, I would love to hear from both of you some ways that you've seen or personally experienced workplace stigma and its impact on mental health and delaying or preventing seeking treatment.
Oh, yeah, I had a lot of struggles with mental health issues when I was working as a journalist at a small town newspaper. And the challenge that I think that I was facing was that it wasn't okay to be tired. It wasn't okay to be, affected by the negative comments that I would get to my articles. It was more an issue of, you don't let these people win. Don't let this kind of, I guess, battle. Don't be a loser. And it was more relegated to kind of an us versus them, more than a mental wellness of I need to recharge. I need to heal. I'm getting battered by these comments that are back to back to back. And it's not necessarily about having kind of macho or bravado, I'm better than you. I'm gonna outlast and outmaster you. But it's more of an internal, like, I'm hurt by these comments and I have the right to be hurt by these comments and affected by them. And I need to take a break and I need to recharge. And the stigma that, I was facing is that sometimes people, they focus more on your labor than they focus on your well-being. And there are times when, as an employee, where the labor needs to be secondary to the wellness that you need to have.
Thank you for sharing
Imadé.
that.
Yeah. So a huge chunk of my story specifically with this sort of stigma, half of the story is in my previous career. So I've made one of the more amusing jumps in my career that I've seen anybody make. I'm an ordained Presbyterian pastor, and I spent 3.5 years in ministry. And Imadé, everything you were just saying is like, yeah, that as a pastor, you are valued for your labor and for appearing to be doing your labor, and to do so with a smile, and to show a sort of Christ-like resolve. At the same time that you're getting bombarded from every angle, and that it is not okay for you to be angry. It is not okay for you to be tired. It is not okay for you to be confused. And at the time, I did not know it, but I was dealing with all these things that pastors often deal with undiagnosed ADHD. And my big line on it was that my experience was that I was perceived as lazy. That was a word that came up a lot in reviews with boards, was that I was lazy. And recognizing sort of later that, yeah, I wasn't working effectively or getting work done, but it wasn't because I didn't want to. It was because I couldn't. I didn't have the resources. And there was so much, there is so much stigma around about what mental health, like mental illness, looks like. And the lack of understanding about how much mental illness can just be your performance is slipping. So that's the biggest chunk of my story, I think, in terms of stigma, was that mental illness looks like anything other than mental illness, and we want it to be anything else because people don't know what to do and they're afraid.
Thank you, Matt, for that. And I think, you know, a lot of what both of you shared definitely resonates. You know, in terms of my own personal experience, I've always been sort of, you know, a high achieving, you know, hard charging person, pretty cheerful when I'm not sort of in an anxious place. And for me, I did get my diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder probably in high school, college. But it was something that I kept very close to the vest because I really saw it as a personal weakness, and I was very embarrassed about it, and was in, you know, competitive schools, competitive workplaces, and felt a lot of shame. So definitely, I think what's interesting for me is that it was a concern about, you know, stigma from other people, but also definitely very much that self stigma too. Which even now I still sometimes bump up against, despite the work that I do. And, you know, frankly, was only open about my own mental health challenges a few years ago when I decided to start Mindshare Partners. And that was the decision point for me. Was I willing to tell my personal story to be the authentic leader that an organization like this needs? And that was a hard decision to arrive at. But in terms of where this most showed up at work for me was I had was several months into a new job, and it was a somewhat dysfunctional workplace and was very understaffed. And so that was a time that arguably I should have been going to my therapist more rather than less. But there was a policy for new hires that you couldn't work from home on Fridays like the rest of the organization until you had completed 6 months there. And so I was commuting from San Francisco uh, and so realized I would need to sort of say why I actually needed to work from home if I had to do that. And now in retrospect, I wish I had made up sort of like a regular allergy shot appointment or something that I needed. But because I was still really trying to prove myself, and also just had this sense, right or wrong, that others would perceive me differently, or, you know, not think that I could hack my job, I just stopped seeing my therapist as regularly. So I would occasionally, you know, have a phone call with her in the evening, but it was far less. And I had also, prior to starting that job, stopped my medicine to try to get off it. And so it was this perfect storm of events that led to anxiety, which then just spiraled to the point that it became debilitating depression, and a leave of absence was essentially the only course. And I think that really could have been avoided if I had had some of those supports in place. You know, and I'm certainly not blaming that organization. I think it was my perception of what would have happened if I had said, actually, I need to see my therapist, when people didn't know me very well. And so that clearly was harmful to me and harmful to that organization as well, and is something that I think very much could have been prevented. So I really appreciate each of you sharing your stories. I know that that's a hard thing to decide to do. So clearly each of you has a really powerful story in overcoming that stigma within your workplaces. And I'd love to hear from both of you just some of the ways that you overcame that fear and shame and uncertainty to ultimately really seek the treatment and support that you needed.
I can go. Also, I have trouble hearing Matt, so let me know if there's anything that I can do.
Or anything that I can do.
Yeah. So what I dealt with when I was working at that newspaper job was a lot of shame, because I compared myself to other coworkers who were able to get and be faced with a lot more, much harsher criticism than I was, and they were just able to take it and go into the work the next day. And I couldn't handle it. If something, if someone felt like, they didn't like my work, it would be completely debilitating. And I didn't even know at that time, but I was dealing with undiagnosed borderline personality disorder, and that what I was reacting to was a fear of rejection and abandonment. And I didn't even have the tools at that time to be able to emotionally regulate what I was feeling. But yeah, it was difficult. It was definitely difficult. And on top of that, I was the only Black person in the newsroom. So I would, come across news about police brutality, things that were happening in the area that were just horrific, and I didn't have anybody else to grieve with at my job. So I also had the isolation of having a undiagnosed mental illness, and then I also had on top of that feeling isolated when it comes to there was nobody that looked like me in the newsroom. I had to eventually leave that job because of mental health challenges. And what I learned in getting my next job is that my mental health challenges can actually be an asset and a strength because the lived experiences that I had at the old job, it helped me in the work in the new job because it was a mental health organization. And so they wanted people who were hospitalized, they wanted people who were in therapy and who, had really debilitating challenges. And so I really want to encourage folks that, the very thing that you think is a burden can be an asset to a different organization. And if you leverage it properly, it can be a huge strength. And so at the mental health advocacy job that I worked at, I was able to utilize the lived experiences I had to kind of share what it's like to go through this and help with the communication strategy at that organization. And at that organization, it was a challenge for me mental health wise. And even though everybody was a lot more open about their mental health struggles, I felt the stigma of I can't ask anybody for help or I'm the most mentally ill out of all these mentally ill people. that was my self stigma. Like I was the sickest of all the sickies. And that was something that I dealt with. And I had to work out with my therapist that, everybody's needs are different. You're just seeing a portion of their lives. And if you focus more on your own well being, you don't have to worry about all the other comparisons that are going on. And yeah, I had to take a leave of absence at that job too. It was tough. I dealt similar to what you dealt with, Kelly, when it comes to just being understaffed. And it was difficult because when you're a black woman and you're at an understaffed setting, you feel like a mule. You feel the generational trauma, the generational burden of all of my ancestors have dealt with this feeling of we get all the work and we get the least of the support. And so it was a challenge of how do I communicate this weight that I'm feeling, that I'm all alone, I'm understaffed, I'm not qualified to do all this work, this is outside of my job description. How do I advocate for myself in this situation? And that's the challenge that I dealt with in the workplace is I have a mental health condition that makes me feel like I'm helpless. It makes me feel like I have no choices. And so how do I find the choices in a situation where my depression is saying I have none? And I think that working with a therapist, it helped me to see that you don't always have to quit. Sometimes you should quit, but you don't have to always quit in the middle of a crisis. That there are other options. So yeah, it has been a journey. I've made a lot of mistakes. The mental health job that I had, I quit twice. I quit. I
Nice.
quit. So I was in an airport on vacation. I'm the only person who quit on vacation. So I was on vacation, but I was having a severe mental health crisis, and the airline that I was working with mistreated me. I didn't feel like I was being respected, and I had a mental health crisis at the airport, and I quit. And I quit via email, and just said I just can't do it. And my boss at the time, uh, I'm just so glad I was in a mental health organization. He was like, "You're in crisis. You can't make decisions when you're in crisis. So rethink. Think about it." And fortunately, working at a workplace that was didn't have that type of stigma, I was able to take my resignation letter back. And so I just also just encourage folks that are listening in that communicate, 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 so that you're not uh, doing a lot of things that aren't helpful in the middle of a crisis. Communicate before the crisis. Don't be like me and quit twice on your job. So yeah.
So I'm going to try and tell the really short version of this story, and I'm going to do my best. I crashed out of ministry like a meteor, and it was a spiral of anxiety and depression. I went on antidepressants. They did a decent job of stabilizing me, but it was one level more than it was a leave of absence with no coming back. It was a sort of a terrible situation, and I spent 3 weeks face down in my sister's couch, just being until I could get back on my feet. And then I got a job, and I got a job, and I got a job in technology. And that third job, I'd done IT in college and then gone off and done ministry, and now I was back doing IT. That third job was a contract with a sort of subset of Verizon that is too complicated to explain. And at about that time, I said, I had benefits for the first time since I had left the ministry. And I was seeing a therapist, and I had a job, and I had a house, and things were pretty okay. Things were actually pretty stable, and I was still miserable. And so I finally got, my therapist made a referral, and I got a psychiatrist. And I walked into the psychiatrist, and I did the psychiatrist intake interview stuff. And I will never forget, dude asked me his last question. He was like, and so what do you do for fun? And I said, well, I play a lot of video games, like 6 to 8 hours on a weeknight of video games. And he goes, cool. So I'm going to write you a prescription for Adderall. And I was like, do you want to do a test or anything? And he said, so we can give you a battery of tests. It'll cost about $1,000. And at the end of that process, we'll give you the Adderall. And if it works, you have ADHD. And if it doesn't, you don't. Or we can just give you the meds and see if that works. So a couple weeks later, I took my first dose of Adderall on a Monday morning, and the office manager and I just completely cleaned the storage room that had been bothering both of us for 6 months. And I had been having anxiety and depression and just being generally miserable for, looking back on it now, years. And that sort of evaporated within a couple of weeks. And the sensation for me internally was that I went from being sort of the below average, I can just barely scraping by employee, to feeling like a rock star in just about a month. And it was just a really, really strange sensation. Your mileage will vary if you're on the call and you're looking at diagnosis and looking at treatment. I don't know anybody else who's had quite as dramatic a solution as it was for me. But for many, 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 many people that I talk to, they have a mental health issue. They're having a mental health crisis. They're having anxiety or depression, and they go and they get treatment, and then they find out that there's something else going on. There's another layer that they weren't aware of, and it's transformative. But the really sort of key thing, and I want to talk way more about this, but the key thing at first was the benefits. It was that if your healthcare benefits include mental health services as an employer, you are opening the door to transforming your employees from he's getting the job done, she's all right, but she could be better, to the possibility that they're going to be like, oh wow, they had a headwind I didn't know they were facing, and now they're awesome. So yeah, I want to say way more about that, but I have like a 3-point bullet on like things that you as employers can do to support your employees with mental health issues.
Got it. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I do want to go back just briefly to the point about the strengths-based framing, which Imadé raised. That's something that we really believe in at Mindshare Partners so deeply. I think people often just assume that everything around having a mental health condition is a weakness, but in fact, it automatically gives you more empathy, which is a huge management skill. More sort of experience with resiliency and being challenged in that way and pushing through. For me, I think my anxiety has actually fueled a lot of my ambition. It's certainly gotten out of whack a couple times, but I think we don't often give that the attention that it deserves. So I recognize we have 6 minutes left, and I really want to make sure we cover our solutions too. This has been fantastic, and it's gone really quickly. So at Mindshare Partners, all of our programs really tie back to the evidence-based ways of reducing stigma around mental health specifically, which are social contact, education, and peer support. So I think I would be remiss not to just comment on the fact that this has obviously been yet another devastating week for the Black community in particular, from the death of George Floyd to the discrimination of Christian Cooper. And so, I mean, clearly there's a lot of systemic racism that continues to pervade the US, and it seems like the need for mental health support to process that in the Black community is great, but so is the stigma. And so, Imadé, I would love to hear just briefly from you things that employers could do to help support the mental health of their Black employees in particular.
Yeah, I've never worked at a place where they offered resources, especially in light of police brutality. So that's definitely something there where I think we just need it to be at least acknowledged of what Black folks are carrying into the workplace, into the Zoom meetings. We are carrying so much grief and hurt. And a lot of times we're expected to just act like nothing is happening because no one's acknowledging it. So if bosses can just acknowledge it, whether it's in Slack or whether it's in their morning meeting, to acknowledge that there is a lot of grief that folks are carrying, and just to be sensitive to that would be great. If they can provide resources, that would be even better. I'm relying on a lot of virtual support spaces, healing spaces for Black folks, therapy for Black girls. They had like kind of a healing session virtually last night. There's another organization named Beam. They offer healing spaces and webinars to help process that grief. So I think that if they can just begin with, we know you're hurting. If you can just say that, you're giving Black folks the ability to fully show up in these workplaces, because a lot of times we're expected to only bring a portion of ourselves. So if you're just saying, we know that you're hurting, we understand if this is a difficult time, and then provide resources on top of that, that would be amazing.
Got it. Thank you for that lens.
Thank you, Imadé. And I'm watching the email chain in our Black organizers, leaders, and doers (ERG), acknowledging to one another and sort of sharing their sensation and being together in this moment. And I know how that's powerful. So Kelly, I heard social contact and I heard peer support, and there was a middle one that I want to be reminded of. So what was that middle one?
Education. So Matt, I would love to hear your 3 bullet points.
So
and
these are
Verizon Media has done a lot in terms of internal and external initiatives.
So I'm going to call them top down, bottom up, and in the middle. Top down is engage your leadership. Guru Gaurapan, our CEO, is fantastic. He's been engaged with Dear Manager and Made of Millions for more than a year that I've seen, and he talks about mental health regularly. That's huge. We had our Chief Information Security Officer talked about his bipolar and his own experiences. That was huge. Those sorts of things where you've got senior leaders talking, that creates this huge, wide opening that people can step into. Create spaces for employees at the bottom and let them organize. I got involved because I heard about a neurodiversity employee resource group, and I was like, that's what I want to be doing. And we provide so much peer support. I get people who come to me and say, I know that you're with neuro. I've just heard that I might have this diagnosis. What's going on? What do I do? And being able to connect them with other people whose experiences are in common, that's huge. And then in the middle, it's the dumbest stuff. It's benefits and it's sick time. It's making sure that your healthcare benefits cover mental health, and that your sick time includes mental health, and that you say that explicitly. And if you can bring in those 3 layers, and that they specifically connect with peer support, like with all 3, with social contact, peer support, and education, but that they're happening at all 3 levels, that fosters an environment where your employees with mental health issues are supported, and you can find those places where having ADHD, having had anxiety, having had depression, having OCD or any of these things, you carry those with you, and they, depending on your job function, they can make you really good at your job. And if we can slot employees into those spots where their neurodivergences and their mental health stories impact positively the job, that's it makes you really competitive. It gives you a whole different lens on how to make money and how to serve your customers.
Absolutely. So I'm conscious of the time, and I feel like we've just started to scratch the surface here. So I'm really, really bummed that we've got to wrap up. But I wanted to just say a huge thank you to both of you for joining us today. I think both of your perspectives just have been incredibly helpful. Everyone, you can find Imadé and her work on depressedwhileblack.com and Matt on LinkedIn at Matt Johnstone of Verizon Media. From a Mindshare Partners perspective, we have an upcoming institute on June 10th to certify individuals in how to create a workplace culture of mental health. And that's across a lot of different companies. We have ongoing training and advising services for managers, executive teams like Verizon Media, which we worked with, and ERG and other advising.
We're very excited to be continuing to work with Made of Millions and Mindshare Partners on mental health trainings for all employees coming soon. That's
Absolutely.
We're super jazzed.
Absolutely. And we also have a free toolkit to support employee mental health during the pandemic, as we know that's bringing up a lot for people. So just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining in. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to do your questions, but hopefully this was helpful. And thank you to Made of Millions for the platform, and to Imadé and Matt again for sharing your stories and expertise. So thank you, and have a great weekend.
Imadé, thank you so much. And thank you, Kelly. This was really great.
Great. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.